Hi, let's talk executive. And this is where we're going to go. These are the things you need to know. And separate presentations coming up there on different models of executive power, and indeed the role prerogative, but we'll deal with those when time permits. Still quite a lot for us to get through in the allocated 15 minutes. In fact, we've got all of this to try to get through. This is what government looks like. This is, as the thing says there, the structure of government. Government's job really is running government, and all of these different departments, whether it's health or education, communities, DEFRA, international development, treasury, CPS, all of these things are run, well, they're part of government, and of course they are effectively run by government. There's another way of looking at it. We can also look at it this way. Um, these are figures from 2011, 2012, and it's a vague idea of how much money these places get to spend. So the Department of Work and Pensions, gets a budget there of just under £200 billion. We can see here health is less. Scotland getting 33.5 billion. You can browse your way around that. Some really interesting figures scattered all the way over there. So this is what government is. It's all of these different departments working together to run the country. And of course, we know that government gets its authority from Parliament, and the rules of the game are chosen from, accountable to, and operating through Parliament. So it just bears repeating at this stage that parliamentary government is at the bedrock of all of this, and that government itself has no intrinsic authority. It only exists as long as Parliament lets it. Now, government itself is divided into two different sections. We've got what we call the permanent executive and what we call the political executive. And the permanent executive are what you might call, or what you should call, the civil service. And these are career bureaucrats. They're people who've gone into the civil service. They're working there, and it's their job. They don't fight elections. They're not members of a political party. What they do is they run the country. They're career bureaucrats. They're technocrats. They're office monkeys. Their job is to come up with policy and then to implement it. Now, the permanent executive, technically speaking, is not part of the curriculum, but it does help if you know how it works. First of all, they're permanent. That means that they don't change after the election. Secondly, they're neutral. They perform their role without political or partisan bias. It doesn't matter whether you vote Labour or vote Conservative. You obey the government minister who's running your department, whether he's Conservative, Liberal, Labour, whatever. The idea is that and when you're a civil servant, you check in your politics at the door, and then you go on and you do your job. One of the things about being a civil servant is that you're supposed to be anonymous. Responsibility for the decisions that are made by government resides not with the permanent executive, but with the political executive. It's their job to make the decisions, and it's their job to take the blame if it goes wrong. And so we say that civil servants are held to be anonymous. A civil servant should never be named and shamed, is really what this goes down to. And there are perhaps a few articles or a few instances that we can look at later where we see this principle being violated. But anyway, that's the civil servants. You need to know they exist. You need to know more or less how they work. But you're not going to get a question on it, is what I'm trying to say. You will, however, get questions on the political executive. But before we get on to that, I mentioned earlier the role. The role is to advise the political executive on policy making and the implementation of that policy. So, what is the political executive? Well, these are what we would normally call government ministers, and of course, they are career politicians. These are guys who go into a party and they contest elections. They're all political appointments. And these political appointments will change depending upon the circumstances, depending upon what the Prime Minister wants. But of course, whenever a party loses a general election and is no longer the party of government, then we have a wholesale change of these government ministers. The whole top tier gets taken off. And the role of the political executive is to make decisions. This is it, okay? The role of the executive, the permanent executive, government ministers, is really to make decisions, and of course to take responsibilities for those decisions. But let's come back to this idea here. They're political appointments that change from time to time. We can see that here. Here is the civil service. Let's say, for example, that is our civil service, and then we started in 2008. 2008, well, it was Brown who was running the country. Now, of course, in 2010, that all changed. Off he went, and in came the coalition. Now, this bit here, the permanent executive did not change. They had to keep doing their job. It didn't matter who was in charge, whether it was the coalition or indeed in 2015, whether or not it's Cameron and his mob. These guys don't change. They don't get turfed out after an election. They have to stay there and provide continuity and advice, irrespective of who's in charge, whether it's the Conservatives themselves or the coalition or Brown. Doesn't matter. These guys stay the same while their political masters change. Hence, they are the permanent executive. And of course, that only works if they're neutral. They can't phone it in if Labour's in charge and they happen to hate Labour or do a particularly good job for the Liberals. They have to be neutral. They have to put all of that to the side and just do the very best job they can in terms of offering advice and helping the implementation of policy. Another way of looking at this really is this way: the civil servant delivers the advice, the permanent executive returns that in the shape of policy. So, for example, if for example the government wanted a health and welfare bill, there it is. So the health and social care bill would be drafted in the civil service. It would then go to the executive. They'd have a look at it. They'd say, okay, yeah, we kind of like the look of that. We think this is a good thing. And then, of course, they'd send that off to Parliament, and Parliament would look at it. And if they thought it was a good thing, then they would return it. And instead of getting the Health and Social Care Bill, you get the Health and Social Care Act. And so that bill now comes back to the executive. The executive go, okay, well, we now need to implement this, so we pass it on to the relevant civil servants. But again, the key point here is that the executive assume responsibility for that. As far as we're concerned, it is their decision that we should have this particular Social Care Act, and they will be held responsible for the implementation and the success, or indeed the failure, of that act. I hope that makes some sense. Go back, have another look at it again, and come to me with your questions, because it's a key idea here. It's a difference between having the idea or having the idea and then working out the details. Who's got responsibility for what? Where is this policy coming from? Who's drawing up the policy? And who is going to accept responsibility for that policy if it all goes horribly wrong? So, departments and agencies, this is the sort of building block of government, and this is lifted straight from the government website. You can see it there, government.gov.uk/government, how government works. Very good website. Do go and have a look at it. Basically, the state is broken into 24 ministerial departments, 22 non-ministerial departments, and 300 other agencies. All of these being part of government. And as it says there, you've got things like the Ministry of Defence and the Department for Work and Pensions and Education and all of those other things. Executive agencies and other public bodies, it won't hurt if you know about them, but they're not part of the curriculum. They're not going to be an exam skill. Although somebody the other day was asking me what a quango is, and a quango kind of goes into this particular body here. So the government is broken into all of these different departments: education, health, treasury, and so on and so forth. But all of them follow a similar sort of pattern. You will have one prime minister, you will have secretaries of state and cabinet ministers, other ministers, giving us a grand total there of 119. And if we look here, these are all of our cabinet ministers. And you can see here the principal departments of state. We've got the Treasury here, or the Exchequer. We've got the Home Office. We've got Foreign and Commonwealth, Justice, Defence, Work and Pensions, Health, and so on and so forth, all the way down. We're going to have a little closer look at education in a little while. But before that, the other cabinet ministers out there are these guys here: Robert Hamilton, Matt Hancock, Rick Hanswell. You can read them yourself. So these guys are not actually in charge of a department of state per se, but they are allowed to come along and attend cabinet. So, for example, here, Priti Patel, who is Minister of State for Employment, she is actually part of the Department of Work and Pensions. So she is answerable to him, and yet she is allowed to attend cabinet, as indeed is Anna Soubry. And if we look here, we've got Chief Whip, they're allowed to come along. Member of State, she is essentially the Foreign Office spokesman in the House of Lords. Minister without portfolio, well, that's what it says on the tin there. Minister for the Cabinet Office, we'll talk about the Cabinet Office a little bit later. But anyway, these are the people who are allowed to attend Cabinet. And if we look at the Department of Education, we can see here more or less how that works. We've got a Secretary of State for Education, that is Nicky Morgan. And underneath her, we've got a couple of Ministers of State, one for Skills and one for Schools. And then underneath them, we've got a spate of parliamentary under secretaries of state. So there's a hierarchy of ministers here. Again, whether or not that's going to come up, probably not. But if you understand how that works, it's not going to do you any harm at all. In terms of responsibility, they have two types of responsibility. We've got individual responsibility and collective responsibility. Individual responsibility is the straightforward one. That is, everyone is responsible for their own behavior and for the performance of their department. So if the department makes an error, the minister is supposed to accept responsibility for that particular error. And we'll look perhaps at how that works at some point in the future. But the other point is collective responsibility, and this is binding on all members of government. And essentially it says that any decision of government is held to be binding on all members of government. In other words, you can't say, oh, I disagree, and hope to stay within government. And we saw the best example of that in the Iraq War. When we were having the vote on Iraq in 2003, only 2 ministers said, we actually think this is a bad idea. And they resigned. That was Robin Cook and Claire Short. Lots of people afterwards have come out and say, yeah, we didn't quite get that one right. But really, they shouldn't have done that. They can't distance themselves from a decision once it's been made. But again, we'll talk more about that in class because I have a limited amount of time in this particular presentation. Let's have a little look at Cabinet. Again, this is straight from how government works. And Cabinet is essentially the management committee that sits behind the Albion PLC. It's the management committee of government. And the key point here is that Cabinet's role is to make decisions and to determine policy. And we saw earlier that you've got about 28 people who come along to that. The PM chairs those Cabinet meetings, and that puts them in a position of extreme power. But the key point, again, is that Cabinet itself is supposed to be this collective decision-making body. Again, this is a complicated concept, but we can talk about it in class and hopefully try to put some meat on those bones. I mentioned the Prime Minister. His official titles are First Lord of the Treasury and Secretary of State for Civil Service. But the one that you're interested in is this one, Primus Inter Pares, and that means first among equals. Now, it doesn't make any sense. Don't try to get your head around it. It doesn't make sense. But this describes the relationship between the Prime Minister and the other members of Cabinet. So all of the other Secretaries of State sitting next to the Prime Minister, we say that the Prime Minister is first among equals. And we'll talk a little later about what specific powers attend to the Prime Minister and how he's able to exploit that to dominate the system. I'm just going to pretty much finish on 2 important offices. We've got Cabinet Office, and you can see what that does there. This is a general office that's there to help the government do its job. And then we've got number 10 office, which is not dissimilar, but it's there to help the Prime Minister do his job. So Cabinet Office there helps the government generally. It's about joined up government. The Cabinet officers should be able to coordinate all the different opportunities, the organisations of state, while also taking special responsibility for security and intelligence. Number 10 office is the special office that attends to the Prime Minister, and this has just grown dramatically over the last 40 or 50 years. So that is very, very significant. I just want to say a little thing about SPADs. These are special political advisors. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. The key point is they're employed by individuals, not the state. And as a result, the nature of their advice is very different. They will give a minister, or they will give whoever's employing them, political advice, rather than perhaps than statecraft. That is what's best for government. And their employment depends on the employer, not the state. And so they're much more likely to give slightly targeted advice. And again, we'll look at that in class. Here's a little thing that will show you the extraordinary numbers of SPADs that are out there. Those are all SPADs there, answering to the Prime Minister. We can see there SPADs for the Chancellor and for the Secretary of State. Take a little time to look at that. You will be amazed just how many SPADs there are. And these are in addition to all of the civil servants out there. There's an up-close version of the SPADs attending to the big 3 offices of state. I'm going to finish there. There's an awful lot still to talk about, but I'm kind of out of time. Here's our standard set of resources. These are all the StoneNet things, the stacks of them out there. But I'd also direct you towards this one. This is a very, very good blog here, and I'm out of time. So let's take questions in class. Bye now.